Black Widow abandoned without clothes at the auction, until a giant cowboy said, "You're coming with me." The dust swirled around Miriam Bonnet's bare feet as she stood on the wooden auction block in Copper Ridge. Her dress hung in tatters from the coach robbery that had left her stranded 3 days prior. The jeering crowd saw only what they wanted to see: a destitute woman with dark skin and nowhere to run. Auctioneer Ezekiel Thrall wiped sweat from his brow as he gestured toward her with theatrical disgust. His voice boomed across the gathered townspeople like a carnival barker selling damaged goods. The bidding started low and stayed there. Miriam clutched a small leather satchel against her chest, the only possession she had managed to save from the wreckage. She had been a schoolteacher once, back east where her students called her Miss Bonnet, and hung on every word she spoke about literature and mathematics. That life felt like someone else's dream now. The crowd's laughter cut through her memories like broken glass. A shadow fell across the auction block. The crowd's jeering died to whispers. Miriam looked up to see a giant of a man pushing through the mass of people. He stood at least 6 feet and 8 inches tall with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. His weathered face carried kindness and eyes that had seen too much. The giant cowboy stepped forward and dropped coins into Thrall's outstretched palm. The auctioneer's protests died in his throat as more money appeared, enough to silence any objection. The cowboy shrugged off his long coat and draped it over Miriam's shoulders. The fabric still held his warmth. He looked directly at her with something she had not seen in weeks: respect. The crowd parted as he led her away from the auction block. Whispers followed their path down the dusty main street. Miriam's bare feet found steadier ground with each step. The satchel remained pressed against her heart. They stopped outside a saloon with painted windows and a sign that read Clara Mees. A woman with graying hair and sharp eyes watched from the doorway. Her expression softened as she took in Miriam's condition. Clara Mee Hargrove had run her establishment for 15 years. She served anyone with coin regardless of their skin color or past mistakes. The woman stepped aside to let them enter. Her saloon offered something rare in these parts: sanctuary. Miriam glanced back at the auction block one final time. Thrall stood counting his coins with suspicious eyes. He watched their retreating forms like a hawk studying prey. The transaction was complete, but something told her this was far from over. The giant cowboy had bought her freedom. Now she needed to figure out what that freedom was worth. Clara Mee closed the saloon door behind them and turned the lock. The afternoon light filtered through painted glass windows, casting colored shadows across worn wooden floors. She moved with purpose toward a back room where clean clothes waited on a simple bed. Miriam accepted the offered garments without words. The dress was plain cotton, but it was whole, clean. When she emerged fully clothed, Clara Mee had prepared a plate of bread and soup, the first real meal Miriam had seen since the coach robbery. The giant cowboy sat at a corner table nursing black coffee. He had removed his hat, revealing sandy hair and a face marked by sun and worry. His presence filled the room, but he kept his distance, watching over her without crowding. A small girl appeared from behind the bar. She carried a slate board and looked no more than 8 years old. Clara Mee's niece had been staying at the saloon while her parents worked their claim outside town. The child approached Miriam with curiosity rather than fear. She held up her slate board, showing crude letters scratched into the dark surface. Miriam smiled for the first time in weeks. The girl was trying to spell her own name. Miriam took the slate and chalk. She wrote the letters clearly and properly spaced. The child's eyes widened as she watched the transformation. Education was a luxury few could afford in Copper Ridge. Clara Mee watched the interaction with interest. She had suspected there was more to this woman than her circumstances suggested. The way Miriam held herself spoke of learning and refinement. The giant cowboy observed from his corner table. Something about watching Miriam teach stirred memories he preferred to keep buried. His sister had been a teacher too, before the swindlers came for her land. Miriam found herself telling the child about books and stories while they worked with letters. The girl absorbed every word like desert sand drinking rain. Learning was happening here in ways the formal classroom could never achieve. Clara Mee pulled Miriam aside as the afternoon wore on. She spoke in low tones about the families in town. Good people who had lost their land to questionable auction proceedings. Men who had worked claims for years only to find their deeds mysteriously invalid. The pattern was always the same. Ezekiel Thrall would find some legal technicality, some missing signature or misfiled document. The property would be seized and auctioned at prices only his associates could afford. Miriam listened with growing recognition. She had seen similar schemes back east, legal theft disguised as proper procedure, the kind of corruption that thrived where people could not afford lawyers or lacked education to fight back. Her mind began working through territorial law as Clara Mee described each case. The woman's detailed knowledge of legal proceedings surprised Miriam. Most saloon owners did not concern themselves with property law and federal statutes. The giant cowboy excused himself as evening approached. He would be staying at the boarding house but would return tomorrow. His parting glance toward Miriam carried protective weight. Whatever his reasons for helping her, they ran deeper than simple charity. Night brought visitors to Clara Mee's establishment. Families who had heard about the woman from the auction block. They came with stories of lost homesteads and legal papers they could not understand. Miriam found herself reviewing documents by lamplight. Her father's training surfaced like muscle memory. He had been born into slavery but earned freedom through legal work, teaching himself law from borrowed books and courthouse observations. She could hear his voice across the years. Knowledge was the one weapon they could never take away. Every statute memorized, every precedent studied, every legal protection learned by heart because their survival depended on it. The Hendricks family had lost their farm to a missing witness signature. The Coopers found their deed declared invalid due to an incorrect filing date. The Washingtons discovered their property boundaries had been mysteriously redrawn. Each case showed Thrall's fingerprints. Each family had been targeted systematically. Miriam began to see the larger pattern emerging from individual tragedies. Clara Mee served coffee and took careful notes as Miriam explained the legal problems to each family. Her questions were too precise to be casual curiosity. She understood court procedures and territorial jurisdiction better than any saloon owner should. Young Amy Henderson brought her slate board to Miriam again. The child lived with her grandmother since her parents had lost their ranch to auction. Learning letters helped her forget the uncertainty of their situation. Miriam taught Amy to write simple words while explaining property law to the adults. Education was education whether the student was 8 or 80. Knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. The families left with more understanding of their legal options than they had possessed in years. Some cases could be challenged. Others might be overturned entirely if the right evidence surfaced. Clara Mee locked the door after the last visitor departed. She began cleaning glasses with movements that suggested deep thought. The evening had revealed capabilities in their rescued auction guests that changed everything. Miriam organized the legal documents into neat stacks. Each case represented a family's dreams destroyed by systematic corruption. But corruption left trails, patterns that could be exposed if someone knew where to look. Outside in the darkness, Ezekiel Thrall stood watching the saloon windows. He had been observing the steady stream of visitors all evening. His instincts told him the woman from the auction block was becoming more than just another victim. She was becoming a problem that required immediate attention. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when heavy boots thundered across Clara Mee's front porch. Ezekiel Thrall burst through the saloon doors followed by Sheriff Hawkins and 2 deputies. Their faces carried the hard satisfaction of men who believed they held all the power. Miriam stood behind the bar helping Clara Mee prepare for the day. She had been awake since dawn reviewing the legal documents from the previous evening. Her father's lessons echoed in her mind as she organized evidence of systematic fraud. Thrall pointed a thick finger at Miriam with theatrical authority. His voice boomed accusations of theft and vagrancy, claims that she was a runaway who had stolen property from the coach robbery. The leather satchel at her side suddenly became evidence of criminal activity. Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward with rusted handcuffs jangling from his belt. His partnership with Thrall was an open secret in Copper Ridge. Justice flowed in whatever direction brought the most profit. Clara Mee positioned herself between the lawman and Miriam. Her normally welcoming saloon had transformed into a battlefield. The morning light streaming through painted windows illuminated the tension crackling through the air. The commotion drew attention from the street. Word spread quickly in small towns when authority figures made dramatic displays. Families who had visited the saloon the previous evening began gathering outside. The Hendricks, the Coopers, the Washingtons, all watching to see if hope or corruption would prevail. Young Amy Henderson pressed against the window with her grandmother. The child held her slate board against her chest. The woman who had taught her to write proper letters was in danger. Jeremiah Lassiter appeared in the doorway like a mountain casting its shadow. His imposing frame filled the entrance as he surveyed the scene. The giant cowboy's presence immediately shifted the balance in the room. Thrall demanded documentation proving Miriam's free status and legal right to remain in Copper Ridge. His words carried the weight of territorial law twisted to serve corrupt purposes. Sheriff Hawkins nodded along like a trained dog responding to familiar commands. Miriam stepped forward with her chin raised. She had spent her life being underestimated by men who confused education with weakness. Her voice carried quiet authority as she addressed Thrall's accusations. She challenged his legal authority to make such demands. Article by article, statute by statute, her memory produced precise territorial law citations that left Thrall sputtering. The auctioneer had expected cowering submission from another victim. Clara Mee began taking notes with suspicious efficiency. Her pen moved across paper capturing every word and gesture. The saloon owner's documentation skills seemed unusually professional for someone who supposedly just served drinks. Miriam opened her leather satchel with deliberate care. The contents had been protected through coach robbery and public humiliation. Legal documents emerged in pristine condition despite her ordeal: property deeds, court certificates, letters of legal standing, evidence of education and professional credentials. The papers told the story of a woman far more accomplished than her circumstances suggested. But Miriam produced something more valuable than personal documentation. She revealed carefully preserved legal papers belonging to the families Thrall had swindled. Evidence collected and safeguarded by someone who understood their importance. The crowd outside pressed closer to the windows. They recognized their own documents among the papers Miriam displayed. Property deeds they thought were lost forever. Legal protections they never knew existed. Thrall's face darkened as he realized the scope of what Miriam possessed. She was not just another victim to be silenced. She was someone who could expose his entire operation. Sheriff Hawkins reached for his weapon with the lazy confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating the powerless. His hand stopped midway as Jeremiah moved forward. The giant cowboy's presence promised consequences that badges and corruption could not deflect. Miriam raised her hand to signal Jeremiah. This fight belonged to her. Knowledge was her weapon, and she intended to use every lesson her father had taught her. She began reciting territorial statutes from memory. Complex legal precedents flowed from her lips with practiced precision. Property law, federal jurisdiction, constitutional protections. A lifetime of study condensed into moments of brilliant legal exposition. The memory came flooding back as she spoke. Her father bent over borrowed law books by candlelight, teaching himself legal principles that slavery had denied him, passing that knowledge to his daughter like a sacred inheritance. His voice echoed across the years with its familiar refrain. Knowledge was the one thing they could never auction away. Every law memorized was a shield. Every statute learned was a weapon. Legal education was survival made manifest. Thrall attempted to interrupt, but Miriam's recitation had gained unstoppable momentum. She dismantled his legal authority with surgical precision. Federal statutes overruled local corruption. Constitutional protections trumped territorial intimidation. Clara Mee's pen continued moving across paper with remarkable speed. Her documentation captured not just words, but legal precedents that could reshape property law throughout the territory. The families outside began pushing into the saloon. They wanted to hear the woman who might restore their stolen dreams. Amy Henderson squeezed through adult legs to reach Miriam's side. Sheriff Hawkins looked to Thrall for direction, but the auctioneer had lost control of the situation. Legal knowledge had transformed victim into prosecutor. The auction block's prize had become his greatest threat. Jeremiah's hand moved to his coat, revealing the edge of something metallic. Not a weapon, but a badge that caught the morning light streaming through painted windows. Jeremiah pulled back his coat to reveal the gleaming federal marshal's badge pinned to his vest. The metal caught the morning light streaming through Clara Mee's painted windows. Sheriff Hawkins stepped backward as federal authority suddenly outranked local corruption. The giant cowboy's voice carried the weight of government backing as he announced his investigation into territorial land fraud. Months of undercover work had brought him to Copper Ridge following reports of systematic property theft. His intervention at the auction had been professional duty meeting personal mission. Thrall's face drained of color as the implication struck home. A federal marshal had been watching his operations, documenting his fraudulent auctions, building a case that could destroy everything he had stolen. Clara Mee set down her pen and moved to a locked cabinet behind the bar. She withdrew a thick folder bound with official ribbons. Her documentation had been far more extensive than simple saloon record keeping. The woman's true identity emerged as she revealed her journalist credentials from back east. Clara Mee Hargrove had come to Copper Ridge specifically to investigate Western corruption networks. Her saloon provided perfect cover for gathering evidence and interviewing victims. 3 distinct skill sets converged in the morning light: Miriam's legal expertise, Jeremiah's federal authority, Clara Mee's investigative documentation. The alliance formed naturally around their shared commitment to justice. Sheriff Hawkins attempted to destroy evidence by reaching for Clara Mee's papers. The families crowding into the saloon blocked his path with bodies positioned for protection rather than violence. Amy Henderson stood directly in front of her grandmother, clutching her slate board like a shield. Miriam continued dismantling Thrall's legal defenses, using territorial statutes he had twisted for personal gain. Each fraudulent auction violated federal law regarding property seizure. Constitutional protections he had ignored carried serious criminal penalties. The memory that drove her precision came flooding back through her father's patient voice. He had been 12 years old when freedom came, but 30 before he learned to read. Borrowed law books became his obsession, as he recognized legal knowledge as the path to true liberation. Late nights by candlelight studying court procedures and constitutional amendments, teaching himself property law and federal jurisdiction through sheer determination, building an understanding that slavery had denied him but freedom made possible. His lessons to young Miriam had been urgent with survival necessity. Learn every law, memorize every protection, understand every right. The legal system could be weapon or shield depending on who wielded greater knowledge. Jeremiah's own driving memory surfaced as he watched Miriam's legal expertise protect the gathered families. His sister Sarah had owned a thriving farm in Kansas before the swindlers arrived. She had trusted their official documents and legal authority. He had been working cattle drives when the news reached him. Sarah's land stolen through fraudulent court proceedings, her appeals dismissed by corrupt judges. The farm that represented everything she had worked for sold to criminals for pennies. The giant cowboy's reputation had been built not through violence, but through methodical pursuit of the men who destroyed vulnerable communities. Federal law enforcement had given his protective instincts official backing and resources. Every investigation brought him closer to the network that had destroyed his sister's life. Every corrupt official arrested was partial payment on a debt that could never be fully settled. Clara Mee opened her folder to reveal detailed records of Thrall's operations spanning 2 years: property seizures, auction manipulations, forged documents, bribed officials. The corruption was systematic and thoroughly documented. Her journalistic training had served the investigation perfectly. Dates, times, witnesses, financial records, evidence that would satisfy any federal court and expose the full scope of territorial fraud. The combination of legal knowledge, federal authority, and investigative documentation created an overwhelming case. Thrall found himself facing the same helplessness he had inflicted on countless families. Amy Henderson approached Miriam with her slate board held high. The child had written a single word across the dark surface: justice. The letters were perfectly formed using the techniques Miriam had taught her. The families pressed closer as they recognized their stolen property deeds among the evidence. Hope replaced desperation, as federal backing gave weight to legal protections they never knew existed. Sheriff Hawkins made one desperate attempt to maintain corrupt authority. His hand moved toward his weapon as panic overcame calculation. The gathered families formed a protective circle around their champions, without violence or threats. Jeremiah's federal authority superseded local law enforcement completely. Hawkins found himself facing arrest rather than dispensing false justice. The corrupt partnership that had dominated Copper Ridge was ending in federal custody. Thrall's empire began crumbling as Miriam explained how each fraudulent auction could be overturned, property rights restored, stolen dreams returned to rightful owners. Legal knowledge was dismantling systematic theft, one statute at a time. Clara Mee's documentation provided the evidence needed for prosecutions throughout the territory. Her investigation had uncovered corruption networks spanning multiple towns and countless victims. The leather satchel that had protected Miriam through robbery and auction revealed one final secret. Among the legal documents was a property deed that would transform everything. Land granted to her father for legal services to the territorial government. The deed described not just a small homestead but substantial territory, including mineral rights. Her father's legal work had earned compensation he never fully explained to his daughter: wealth that could fund education and justice throughout the region. Jeremiah looked at the woman who had evolved from auction victim to community champion in a matter of days. Her legal expertise had exposed corruption, while his federal authority provided enforcement backing. Partnership was replacing protection as their relationship deepened. The morning that began with threats and handcuffs was ending with justice and restoration. Copper Ridge would never be the same. Federal reinforcements arrived in Copper Ridge 3 days later with official warrants and seizure orders. Jeremiah's investigation had reached Washington, where territorial corruption demanded swift federal response. The arrival of additional marshals transformed the small town into the center of a major legal operation. Thrall's assets faced immediate freezing as evidence of systematic fraud mounted. His grand house overlooking Main Street became federal property pending investigation. The auction house where he had wielded corrupt authority was sealed with government ribbons and official notices. Sheriff Hawkins found himself in federal custody facing charges that carried serious prison time. His badge and authority were stripped as legitimate law enforcement took control of Copper Ridge. The corrupt partnership that had terrorized families was officially ended. Miriam stood in the territorial land office reviewing her father's property deed with federal surveyors. The document described boundaries that encompassed far more territory than she had ever imagined. Mineral rights included precious metals and coal deposits worth substantial sums. Her father's legal services to the territorial government had been more extensive than family stories suggested. Court records revealed years of complex legal work that earned him one of the largest land grants in the region, wealth that could transform entire communities through proper development. The Henderson family was among the first to have their property restored through federal intervention. Amy's grandmother wept as she held the corrected deed to their ranch. The child clutched her slate board where she had written the word that defined everything they were experiencing. Clara Mee's journalistic documentation proved invaluable as federal prosecutors built cases against the corruption network. Her evidence reached beyond Copper Ridge to expose similar schemes throughout the territory. The investigation would eventually restore thousands of acres to rightful owners. The former auction block where Miriam had suffered public humiliation became the site of a very different kind of sale. Thrall's seized assets were distributed back to the families he had swindled. Poetic justice played out where injustice had once thrived. Miriam watched from Clara Mee's porch as Thrall experienced the same helplessness he had inflicted on others. Federal marshals loaded his possessions for redistribution while he stood in shackles. The powerful man who had controlled lives through corruption now faced the consequences of his choices. The Hendricks family reclaimed their farm with proper legal documentation. The Coopers discovered their original deed was perfectly valid once corruption was removed from the process. The Washingtons found their property boundaries restored to legitimate measurements. Each family's restoration represented more than returned land. Dreams could be rebuilt. Children could inherit what their parents had worked to create. The systematic theft that had defined Copper Ridge was being replaced by legitimate opportunity. Miriam began planning the use of her unexpected wealth with the same methodical approach her father had taught her. Education was the foundation of lasting change. A school that served all children regardless of background would honor his memory while building the future. Her substantial land holdings could support not just education, but community development, proper medical care, legal services for those who could not afford representation, infrastructure that would make Copper Ridge a model of frontier justice and opportunity. Jeremiah accepted the permanent marshal position that federal authorities offered him. His investigation had proven so effective that Washington wanted him to continue territorial law enforcement. The drifting years could end in meaningful work protecting vulnerable communities. The partnership developing between Miriam and Jeremiah grew stronger as they planned Copper Ridge's transformation. Her legal expertise combined with his federal authority created a formidable force for justice. Personal attraction was deepening into mutual respect and shared purpose. Clara Mee's Saloon became the unofficial courthouse where families learned about their restored rights. Her journalistic skills helped people understand complex legal procedures, while her establishment provided neutral ground for community healing. The territorial governor visited Copper Ridge to observe the federal investigation's results. The successful prosecution of systematic corruption became a model for addressing similar problems throughout the region. National attention focused on the small town where justice had prevailed. Amy Henderson demonstrated her reading skills to visiting federal officials using the slate board Miriam had helped her master. The child's education represented hope that the next generation would be better equipped to protect their rights and recognize corruption. Miriam's transformation from auction victim to community leader became legendary throughout the territory. Her legal expertise had exposed corruption, while her wealth would fund lasting change. The woman who had once stood helpless was now shaping the region's future. The families of Copper Ridge gathered to officially thank their champions during a community celebration. Federal authority had provided enforcement, but local courage had made exposure possible. Justice required both institutional power and individual bravery. Thrall's trial was scheduled for the territorial capital, where his corruption case would set legal precedents. Clara Mee's documentation would serve as primary evidence, while Miriam's legal expertise would help prosecutors understand the full scope of fraud. The federal investigation expanded as similar corruption networks were identified in neighboring towns. Jeremiah would lead a task force targeting systematic property theft throughout the territory. His sister's stolen farm would be avenged through protection of countless other families. Evening brought quiet reflection to Clara Mee's saloon as the community processed their remarkable transformation. The painted windows that had once hidden desperate planning now framed scenes of hope and restoration. Miriam organized legal documents for families who would need proper representation during property restoration proceedings. Her father's lessons continued guiding her work as knowledge became the foundation for community justice. The leather satchel that had protected crucial evidence through robbery and auction now held plans for schools and hospitals. Survival had evolved into service as personal redemption became community transformation. 6 months after the federal investigation transformed Copper Ridge, Miriam stood before a completed schoolhouse that occupied the heart of her inherited land. The building rose from prairie earth like a monument to her father's dreams. Children from every family in the region would learn together within walls that knew no boundaries of color or circumstance. Amy Henderson was among the first students to arrive for opening day. The child who had once struggled with letters on a slate board now read entire passages from proper textbooks. Her grandmother watched from the schoolyard with tears of pride and gratitude. The Bonnet Academy served 43 children that first semester. Sons and daughters of ranchers learned alongside the children of former slaves. Mexican families sent their young ones to study with Irish immigrants and territorial natives. Education was finally available to all who sought it. Miriam had used her substantial land inheritance wisely throughout the months of construction. The mineral rights her father had earned through legal service provided ongoing income that funded not just education but comprehensive community development. A proper medical clinic occupied the building next to the school. Dr. Sarah Matthews had traveled from Chicago specifically to serve the growing community that federal justice had made possible. Healthcare was no longer a luxury available only to the wealthy. Jeremiah's permanent marshal office stood at the intersection of Main Street and Justice Avenue. The street had been renamed during a community celebration that honored the transformation of Copper Ridge from corruption to legitimacy. His federal authority continued protecting families throughout the expanding territory. The partnership between Miriam and Jeremiah had evolved into something deeper than professional collaboration. Their shared commitment to justice had grown into mutual respect and genuine affection. Marriage plans were discussed with the same methodical approach they brought to community service. Clara Mee's newspaper had replaced her saloon as the center of community information. The Copper Ridge Tribune provided transparent reporting on territorial affairs while maintaining her establishment as neutral meeting ground. Truth was her primary product now rather than whiskey and entertainment. Ezekiel Thrall's trial had concluded with convictions on 17 counts of federal fraud. His 20-year prison sentence was being served at the territorial penitentiary, where his former authority meant nothing. The corruption network he had led was completely dismantled. Sheriff Hawkins faced similar justice with a 15-year sentence that would ensure his badge would never again be used for personal profit. Federal oversight of territorial law enforcement had eliminated the corruption that once defined frontier justice. The families who had lost everything to systematic theft were now prospering on properly restored land. The Hendricks had expanded their farm using legitimate bank loans. The Coopers had discovered valuable water rights that came with their corrected property boundaries. The Washingtons were raising cattle on grassland that truly belonged to them. Amy Henderson approached Miriam after the first day of school with a carefully written essay about justice and education. The child's neat handwriting filled 2 pages with thoughts about how learning could prevent corruption from returning. Knowledge was already protecting the next generation. Miriam's evening routine now included reviewing lesson plans rather than legal documents defending desperate families. Teaching had returned to her life as her true calling rather than survival necessity. The schoolmarm who had once fled burning buildings now shaped young minds in perfect safety. The community library occupied the building where Thrall's auction house had once operated. Books replaced the platform where human dignity had been bought and sold. Children read stories where justice always prevailed, while adults studied law and constitutional rights. Jeremiah's federal task force had expanded to cover 3 territories where similar corruption networks required investigation. His reputation for methodical justice brought requests for assistance from communities throughout the region. His sister's stolen farm had been avanaged through protection of thousands. Clara Mee's investigative reporting had earned recognition from Eastern newspapers impressed by frontier journalism. Her documentation techniques were being studied by reporters covering corruption throughout the expanding nation. Truth-telling had become her permanent profession. The territorial governor appointed Miriam to an advisory commission on education policy. Her experience with integrated schooling provided expertise as other communities sought to replicate Copper Ridge's success. Personal transformation had become regional influence. The evening celebration marked 6 months of legitimate prosperity in a community that had once suffered under systematic exploitation. Federal justice had provided the foundation, but local courage had made transformation possible. Miriam looked out from her school porch across land that represented her father's legacy fulfilled. His lessons about knowledge as permanent protection had evolved into community-wide education. Legal understanding was spreading to every family through their children's learning. The leather satchel that had carried survival documents now held wedding plans and architectural drawings for expanded school facilities. Personal salvation had grown into community service as individual justice became collective opportunity. Amy Henderson waved goodbye from her grandmother's wagon as families returned to their legitimately owned homes. Tomorrow would bring more learning in the school where every child mattered equally. Education was writing the future one lesson at a time. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.